Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of 3 workshops exploring the idea of curating nation, a research project that I am developing at UAL's Decolonising Arts Institute. In this first workshop, we consider what a national collection looks like. My name is Hammad Nasar, and I'm a curator, strategic advisor, and principal research fellow here at the Decolonising Arts Institute. And these workshops are a collaboration between the Institute and the British Art Network's Black British Art Research Group. Chairing the workshop will be my co-convener, Alice Correia.
Thank you, Hammad. Hello, everyone. On behalf of Dr. Lizzie Robles and Marlene Smith, I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. As Hammad mentioned, Lizzie, Marlene and I are co-conveners of the British Art Network's Black British Art Research Group, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Established in 2012, the British Art Network is a subject specialist network funded by the Paul Mellon Centre for the Studies of British Art, Tate, and the National Lottery through the Arts Council England. The British Art Network promotes curatorial research, practice and theory in the field of British art. Central to the network is a collective commitment to expanding definitions of British art, acknowledging the complex historical truths and their present-day resonances. The network's members include curators, academics, artists, researchers, conservators, producers and programmers at all stages of their professional lives, and who are actively engaged in caring for, developing and presenting British art. You can find out more about BAN on the network's website, and links are available in to that site in the chat. The network is open to all, so please do get in touch if you'd like to join. The British Art Network comprises a number of thematic research groups, which each stage focused events throughout the year. Please do keep an eye out for the BAN newsletter for details of further events. Marlene, Lizzie and I coordinate the Black British Art Research Group, and this group is specifically interested in critical race issues as they pertain to the histories, collection, production and display of art in Britain. We are looking forward to a stimulating discussion today on the theme Curating Nation. Hammad. Okay.
Now, this workshop series is the first public manifestation of the Curating Nation research project I've been developing through my fellowship here at the Institute. For those new to it, the UAL Decolonising Arts Institute has been conceived as a decentered, porous and evolving space. It seeks to challenge colonial histories and imperial legacies and drive cultural, social and institutional change through artistic, art historical, curatorial, museological and pedagogic practice and research. Links in the chat will direct you to its research residency programs and its YouTube channel, where you can access recordings of a wide range of discursive events. Now, alongside my UAL role, I also wear a number of other hats. And at the Paul Mellon Centre, I co-lead with Sarah Turner the London Asia project that explores the entanglements between the art histories of Britain and Asia. With Irene Aristasabal, I'm co-curating British Art Show 9, the largest recurring exhibition of contemporary art in Britain, organised every 5 years by Hayward Gallery Touring. And my newest hat is that of lead curator at the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum in Coventry, where over the next 18 months, I will be supporting the delivery of the Herbert's programme as part of Coventry City of Culture. In particular, we'll be hosting the Turner Prize exhibition later this year and a national collections-based exhibition co-curated with the local community group in 2022. Now, as you would have observed, that what all these hats have in common is a shared investment in the construction and circulation of stories of nation. So this is not a new interest. The Curating Nation project has come out of the past 15 years of curatorial and research projects in different shapes and sizes in different parts of the world. Lines of Control was a long-term exhibition-led inquiry into the visual culture of partitions. Rock, Paper, Scissors was the National Pavilion of the United Arab Emirates in Venice for the Biennale. There was an action research-based course on Hong Kong art history developed with Hong Kong University and Asia Art Archive, a collaboration with the literary journal Granta, alongside my Green Cardamom colleagues Anita Dawood and Nada Raza on their Pakistan issue. And then at the Stuart Hall Foundation, started a project called Let Our Statues Speak, a pre-Colston attempt to bring difficult conversations around monuments into the spheres of public culture and school curriculum. The Curating Nation project is thus an opportunity to reflect on a set of questions that constantly niggle, like pebbles in a shoe. And these workshops are an opportunity to think about 3 of those questions in public with brilliant colleagues who've been wrestling with similar questions from different perspectives, as museum directors, curators, scholars, and artists. And so the questions are, what does a national collection look like? The subject of this workshop. What stories of British art travel? And then the final workshop is in who gets to write them and where. Now, this is an inquiry rooted in practice around questions of curatorial agency to work in, but also to productively challenge the institutional constraints we operate in. And it comes at a time when questions of nation and belonging are being weaponized. Now, before passing on to Alice to introduce today's workshop and take us away, I wanted to share one recent project as context. Speech Acts, Reflection, Imagination, Repetition at Manchester Art Gallery was an exhibition I curated with Kate Jessen in 2018. It was part of and in conversation with an AHRC-funded research project called Black Artists and Modernism, led by Sonia Boyce, and a collaboration between UAL and Middlesex universities. Working primarily with 4 public collections in Manchester and Bradford, it juxtaposed works considered collection highlights with others usually displayed through the lens of biography and geography. Now, if we think of art as artists making meaning and sharing it with the rest of us, art collections are then a store of such meaning that are displayed to create narratives or stories. Speech Acts explored the possibility for public collections to expand and challenge the existing stories that circulate and perhaps tell new ones.
Okay, I'll just briefly run through the organisation for this afternoon's session. In a moment, I'm going to invite our speakers to present their opening statements. Each will speak for about 5 minutes, reflecting on their experiences in the now, and perhaps asking questions and staging, presenting provocations for a larger discussion. Our respondent will then give their thoughts, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for a larger discussion. At that point, please do put your questions and points for discussion in the chat or the Q&A. At 3:30, we'll have a 15-minute break and return at 3:45, where we will have 2 focused papers giving case studies on how we might think about curating nation. We'll then have there'll be more time for discussion at the end, and we will aim to finish promptly at 5 o'clock. So today's workshop the title is Curating Nation, What Does a National Collection Look Like? And in preparing for this session today, Hammad and I, with my co-conveners of the Black British Research Group, Dr. Lizzie Robles and Marlene Smith, have had a number of conversations trying to tease out what we think are the key issues and debates that we'd like to talk about. So how are national collections formed, and where do we encounter them? What constitutes a national collection? Is it a group of artworks that happen to be held together in a particular place? Or do they somehow reflect or illustrate a national complexion? And if they don't, why not? And what can we do about it? In our preparatory discussions, we also wondered what happens if we shift constructions of British art or British art narratives away from London-centric institutions. As I think we're going to hear this afternoon, the Tate was originally founded as the National Gallery of British Art. But if we move away from that institution geographically and conceptually, is it possible to dismantle the hierarchical structures that positions Tate Britain as the national collection? And can we reconceive it as one of many? How might regional collections reshape that narrative? And what possibilities do digital and distributive models of collection and narrative building hold? Our speakers today will share their experiences, thoughts, and reflections in the current moment. And I'm delighted to introduce them now. They are Anne Gallagher. Anne is an independent curator and was a director of collections of British art at Tate between 2006 and 2019. She led a team of curators responsible for building and researching Tate's collection of British art and specializes in modern and contemporary British art, as well as Latin American art. She's curated numerous exhibitions both at Tate Britain and Tate Modern, and has written extensively on British and international art. Marguerite Nugent is Manager of Arts and Culture, City of Wolverhampton Council, and has been responsible for programming the collections development at Wolverhampton Art Gallery for the past 2 decades. Marguerite has led an acquisitions program that embraces both historical and contemporary art in a variety of media. And she also teaches on the MA Gallery Studies at the University of Essex. Andrew Ellis is the Director of Art UK and has been since 2003. He has a responsibility for the management and strategic direction of the organisation and plays a major role in fundraising for the charity. He was instrumental in transforming the organisation from being the publisher of hard copy catalogues of oil paintings in public ownership to becoming a digital platform for the nation's art collection. And you may be aware of the fantastic resource that is Art UK online. Andrew is also sits on the AHRC's Towards a National Collection steering panel, and was until recently a trustee of the Public Monuments and Sculpture Association. Anne, Marguerite and Andy will speak for about 5 minutes, as I said, and then Sarah Wajid will respond and add her own perspectives. Sarah is co-CEO alongside Zach Mencher of Birmingham Museums Trust. They are the first job share CEO partnership in the museum sector. Sarah was formerly head of engagement at Museum of London and head of interpretation at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in 2017. Before working in museums, she was a cultural commentator, journalist, and editor. She is a trustee of the museum and is a member of the Museum Detox Network for People of Colour in Museums, and is an active advocate for diversity and equality issues in the arts. So having introduced our wonderful speakers, I'd like to invite them to turn on their screens. And Anne, if you wouldn't mind kicking off.
Hello, everybody. I will start. Although I've been working as an independent curator for some time, during the 15 years I worked at Tate, my role centered on the collection, its research, growth and loan. Initially what was within the modern as opposed to the historic part of the collection, and then as the director of the British collection. Displays and exhibitions at Tate sites were overseen by other directors. I'm sorry if I'm going to talk a little bit about history here, but I think it's kind of useful in terms of Tate. So it may be helpful to remember that the history of the national collection differs from that of many European countries in that the UK is a monarchy, so had no royal collection that had been nationalised in the 19th century, nor ex-royal palaces to convert into museums. The British Museum, the first museum in the country, and the National Gallery, the second painting gallery after Dulwich, were founded with collections purchased from private individuals, and Tate began as a mere extension of the National Gallery in 1897, with Henry Tate's donation of a group of contemporary British paintings, to which British works transferred from the National were added. The popular name, the Tate Gallery, was adopted only after the museum was first named the National Gallery of British Art, but it was also referred to as the Gallery of Contemporary Art, and the collection grew in both directions. Not until the 50s did the Tate become legally independent of the National Gallery, and over the course of its history, various keepers or directors displayed extreme frustration at a lack of independence in shaping the collection. For example, the Chantry bequest for British art, which in the early 20th century was the primary source of works for the collection, was administered by the Royal Academy according to the terms of the bequest. But even after the founding of Tate, continued to be selected by the Royal Academy, and to the fury of Tate and contemporary critics, with works almost exclusively by Royal Academicians. The history of the collection has been punctuated by other major bequests and donations of art, until relatively recently, almost exclusively by male artists of very unvaried cultural backgrounds. The bequest of works by Turner, for example, assigned to the gallery, assigned to the Nation, and eventually housed at Tate, numbers over 30,000 works, mostly on paper. So while containing outstanding artworks, these bequests obviously skew statistics concerning the gender and heritage of artists represented in Tate's collection. Purchase grants were eventually assigned to the museum and grew to a high point in the mid-20th century, then have reduced steadily as the government's financial input has reduced to around 30% of the museum's total budget. Tate's acquisitions budget for the entire collection is now relatively minimal, supplemented by raised income, gifts, and bequests. The 1992 Museums and Galleries Act is the most recent legal document to clarify the roles of the Board of Trustees of the National Gallery, the Tate, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Wallace Collection, and lists all the other national museums in London, Edinburgh, Belfast, and Cardiff, as well as the National Museums of Merseyside and the National Trust. The Act essentially outlines that Tate's remit is to maintain a collection of British works of art and 20th century contemporary works of art, to preserve and add to them, to secure their exhibition to the public, to make them available for study and research, and to generally promote the public's understanding and enjoyment. Tate and other national museums also have obligations to government in turn, to fulfill the role of national advisors on the export of works of art leaving the country temporarily or permanently, and on valuations of works of art when they're exhibited in any buildings in the UK accredited to the government-backed indemnity scheme. Tate curators are obliged to prioritize this work alongside their work on exhibitions, displays, and acquisitions. Good governance and transparency require that beyond the legal framework, an acquisitions policy for Tate's collection is reviewed, approved by trustees every 5 years, and published online. It outlines the scope and aims of the collection, clarifies its interaction with other national collections such as the National Gallery, the British Museum, the V&A, etc. It also reflects policies agreed by national and international bodies such as the National Museums Association and the International Council of Museums. In recent times, a more detailed strategy document has been written and presented to trustees every 2 years. This document is obviously highly commercially sensitive, since it outlines which omissions from the past will be addressed and which areas will become a focus for the immediate future. Goals are pursued through a structured system of curatorial research and debate, directors' discussion and approval, then presented to and interrogated by trustees. Beyond the necessity to secure content that will transform an existing collection into one representative of the present and for the future, criteria also considered obviously include conservation, storage issues, display, and loan possibilities. I came to view the national collection as a sum of many parts, one shared among a range of museums and not just those nominated as national by the 1992 Museums Act, but also the many outstanding city collections with areas of excellence that complement those of Tate's. My question is, the economic model museums were obliged to adopt pre-lockdown, that is, with the majority of budgets from self-generated income, required an extreme reliance on ticket income and spend at blockbuster exhibitions. This prioritized the exhibition program in terms of curatorial time, public programs, digital engagement, marketing, press, etc., over engagement with collections. Social distancing will in the short term at least make this model impossible to pursue, placing museums under extreme financial pressure. But is it also an opportunity for greater emphasis to be placed on the collections we hold to improve audience engagement within the physical space of the museum, and importantly, make better use of websites and social media? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. You've given us a brilliant history and raised some really interesting and important questions. Can I hand over to Marguerite?
Thank you. So I'd like to focus on what defines a national collection and who decides what is national as opposed to a regional collection, and in what ways can that be problematic. So I am from Wolverhampton Arts and Heritage Service. We have 3 museums and an archive in our portfolio. And the largest of our sites, Wolverhampton Art Gallery, was founded in 1883, and it was built by a local builder called Philip Horseman on land that was donated by the council. So in many respects, the history of our gallery mirrors that of museums in many other places around the UK that were founded in the Victorian era. And these places often emerged out of a philanthropic gesture on the part of local industrialists, which were intended to improve the lives of local people. And there was also an element of civic pride because, of course, having a major cultural site at the heart of your city was a way of announcing yourself. It meant you'd really landed. And of course, places like Wolverhampton at that time were newly expanding and emerging towns. So when you look at dictionary definitions of national, they tend to focus on some key things. It's about being representative of the whole nation rather than just part of it. It's about being typical of people or customs of the country. It's about citizenship, and it's about the state. And in thinking about our own priority collections at Wolverhampton, we tend to consider it a slightly different way. So we ask ourselves the question, what is nationally significant in our collection? And these are the sorts of things that we think about. So we think about, what do we hold that has a relevance to the whole country? What are the unique and rare aspects of our collection? And what defines us and sets us apart from other collections? And also, it's inevitable that this will evolve and change as collections grow. So, for example, for many years, our collection of work about the Troubles in Northern Ireland was the most comprehensive in the UK. However, particularly as museums in Northern Ireland are catching up in terms of acquiring Troubles-related art, this is no longer the case. So it's something that we have to constantly reflect on. And actually, it's only recently that our collections have developed in a strategic way. So when the art gallery first opened in the 1880s, the collection was founded on 3 major bequests by local industrialists. And these were their personal collections, mainly of British genre painting. And it's only really since the 1960s that the collection has been developed in a strategic way when a curator was appointed. So I don't have lots of time to talk about our key collections, but there are 3 that I'm just going to sort of highlight. One which I've mentioned already around the collection of Troubles art, and this was formed in the early 1990s through a partnership with the Contemporary Art Society. And it was a collection that emerged from both a pilot scheme and a full collecting scheme called the Special Collection Scheme that spanned about 7 years or so between 1993 and 2005. And then that led to further collecting initiatives that helped us to build on that collection in partnership with the Imperial War Museum as well. And I think that's another interesting point, that regional collections are often encouraged to body up with national collections to collaborate on acquisitions and research. And then the second area is our pop collections, which goes back even further to the 1960s, when the curator David Rogers was collecting work that was contemporary of the time. He had a good knowledge of the contemporary arts scene, and he wanted to create an identity for the collection. And then the third collection is a collection about the Black art movement, and that's very much linked to the history of the city, because Wolverhampton hosted the first Black art group exhibition in 1981. But it was only in recent years that we started to acquire work by artists associated with the Black art group. And it's only recently that important part of the city's history is being reflected in our collections. So these are the three collections that we talk about being nationally significant. And I'd like to suggest that it isn't necessarily the definition of national that's the debatable thing. It's more the question around who decides what is nationally important. And one of the things that we're doing in Wolverhampton now is that we're starting to work more with our local communities and experts to bring more perspectives to our collection, to help us to identify important objects and what they mean, and also where are the gaps in the history of our city and how is that reflected by our institution. So next, let's just look for a minute at how does the sector identify what are significant collections. Well, you've got the designation scheme, which is administered by the Arts Council, and that identifies, in their own words, the best collections, and celebrates outstanding collections which deepen our understanding of the world and what it means to be human. And to become a designated collection, you make an application, and this is assessed by a panel of sector specialists. And there are various benefits associated with being a designated collection. It opens up funding streams, it increases national profile, it provides a platform for advocacy and raising awareness, and strengthens support from governing bodies. So I think there's a question around the designation scheme and how fit for purpose is that in today's world. And by drawing only on a panel of sector and academic experts to make these decisions, then I would argue that we're not seeing the whole perspective on what is nationally significant or important. And that's important because designated collections have this advantage in terms of gaining funding opportunities and profile. And so that can sometimes skew whose voice is being heard and limit the contributions that can help us to understand more about our history. And then finally, I just want to think a little bit about the concept of national museums and national networks. Well, for one thing, national museums tend to be London-centric. So there's only one English National Museum outside of London, and that's the National Museums Liverpool, although of course there are others like the Science Museum Group that have sister museums in the regions. And of course the national museums work with regional museums in many fruitful partnerships, but I think we need to make sure that these partnerships are developed equitably and collaboratively, with learning being shared meaningfully as part of a two-way process. And I think we need to think about how regional museums can contribute to reshaping national programmes, because it's often in regional museums where there's less political interest that exciting stuff can happen. So I think we need to really think also about some of the networks. So there's the English Museums Directors Network and the Civic Museum Directors Network as two distinct bodies. And yet some civic museums are part of the National Museums Network and some aren't. And the MDC defines membership as directors of chief executives of the UK's national collections and major regional museums. Yet if you look at the membership, not all of them are. So I think there's a question there around, you know, what defines national and what defines civic, and how does which civic museums are major regional museums, etc. So I'd argue that we need greater transparency around membership of these bodies. And in addition, these networks need to look at who isn't around the table. And the reason why that's important is because these networks are a powerful lobbying voice for the sector. So they do have a really important, powerful role to play that can affect change. And by thinking about membership, that will lead to greater inclusivity, which will lead to greater diversity, so that we've got a greater number of voices and perspectives. And this is where then the problem solving and the exciting things start to happen, and we've moved towards a greater understanding of how we've got to be where we are now. So that's why I think in terms of terms like national can be problematic because it suggests a collective view, which is okay if it is fully representative, but I think we still have some ways to go with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marguerite. That's so rich and so many questions. Brilliant. Andy, can I turn to you now?
Alice, thank you. And a great honour to be here. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm obviously going to talk about this in the light of Art UK's work. So this is very much a question around what does a national collection look like in a digital age? And I've got three themes. The first is, what does one include? The second is, how do we share it? And the third is, how do we give agency over it? So let's start with what do we include? I mean, Art UK, previously Public Catalogue Foundation, set up to create access to this extraordinary collection that we all own, much of which is in store, much of which had not been photographed. In our original focus, and this still is very much our major focus now, we were focused on those collections that could be liberally defined as being publicly owned. But very importantly, this was not just museums. And interestingly, only about a third of the institutions on Art UK, and there are over 3,000 institutions on Art UK, are museums. Key focus was to bring in those wonderful collections in our universities, in our hospitals, civic buildings, quirky places like fire stations where you wouldn't expect to find artworks. So that was really important. And also, this is very much a UK-wide project. This is, from the Shetland Isles to the Isles of Scilly, very much embedded in the local. So that's really critical to the way that we've run this project. And many of the collections, when I last looked, approaching 50% of the collections had 10 or fewer works. So there's a very long tail of very small collections that are part of this, but I think they're incredibly important to the democratization of the sharing of this. And I think reflecting this, interestingly, our staff now, only a third of our staff are based in London, and we don't actually have an English office anymore. We have only an office in Scotland, and 20% of our staff are in Scotland. But interesting, this question about public versus private, when we've asked the audience before, does it really matter if we share with you things that are in private collections, and the answer is no, it doesn't really. And for researchers, it probably doesn't really matter whether an artwork is in Chatsworth or a corporate collection. So I think that's an interesting question of what one defines in national. Our focus, though, principally is on those public collections. I think one mustn't forget this is very much a global collection. Obviously includes Renaissance paintings from Italy, bodhisattvas from Japan. And I think the interesting thing about digital allows us to do a number of things here. So for example, as particular items, I'm thinking Benin bronzes, as they might leave this country, go back to their rightful owners, those records can still stay, we can still learn about them digitally. And indeed, paintings that have been deaccessioned, I'm thinking here of Hertfordshire County Council's Great Schools Loan Scheme, which was sold off, that should be recorded. We're lucky enough to have recorded the artworks that were destroyed. So for example, paintings destroyed in fires in Ramsgate and Glasgow, School of Art. So there is, the collection here is over time, not at a fixed point. I think also importantly, to us, the presence of an image is really important in what we've done. So big focus in our project on digitization, two big projects to date, oils and sculptures. Going forward, a challenge for us, I think, is the lack of funding for digitization. So it means for us, we will be able to expand our remit to, by bringing on existing digitized artworks onto the site. But this lack of digitization funding means that those local collections, which have been so important to us to date, Artworks by minority ethnic artists that are not in oil, for example, won't be recorded. And I think we do need to think very seriously about where that funding comes from digitization. We're at the early stages here. We're not even 300,000 artworks on Art UK. And just put this in context, I was at a webinar this morning for the German Digital Library, which has 37 million objects on it. I mean, albeit, well beyond art. So what's important here is to recognize that what we're doing in Art UK is just a portion at the moment. The sculpture and the oils, one has to be aware that this is not a distorted view of what the real national collection is beyond that. Very, very important, that is, I believe. So in terms of what to include, it's fluid, it's changing, it's widely distributed, it's possibly misleading, and by nature, it's incomplete. How do you share it? So for us, the big principle here is that this is a collection of art that is owned by everyone across the UK, irrespective of colour, gender, socioeconomic class. That's a massive part of our mission, is to ensure that you can find artworks on the site that interest you, and that then we encourage curiosity to look further. And I think we have learned lessons from the past, digitization projects such as the NOF project, where you ended up with digital graveyards of objects, and that's absolutely critical to us that we really engage audiences. And interestingly, the German Digital National Collection, German Digital Library, we might have 1% of their objects, but interestingly, we have over twice their traffic. So engaging audiences to see the artworks is very, very important. And for us, a critical thing has been moving away from just simply showing the objects, but telling the stories behind them. Absolutely critical to the way we've worked. And naturally, this is, the stories about the canon are on there, but central to our content strategy, and it's just gone to the board recently, improved by the board, has been this focus on telling the stories behind. Artists have not had the recognition that they're due, partly due possibly to their gender, possibly due to their colour. And this is a big focus of our content strategy. It's monitored, it's targeted. And so for us, amplifying those marginalized voices, telling those suppressed stories is really critical. Bringing in a wider range of authors. We now have about 600 people writing for us. And obviously that, needs, sometimes new authors need help, and we're willing to put that help in to help them tell the stories on the site. Geography, it can't be just London-centric, it has to be across the UK. And very importantly, there's a big focus on telling stories behind the subject matter. At the simplistic level, telling stories about hats and art, but much more complex than that is, now, and something I'm personally interested in is asking for more stories about the histories behind artworks, and to tell those uncomfortable stories about artworks that are on the site, where you have an 18th century portrait, but there's actually a far more uncomfortable story behind it. Absolutely critical. And I do, for people on this call, we would love to be able to tell stories of research that you might be doing that you would like to tell to a mainstream audience. And I might add that under 5% of our audience is researchers. So telling stories is really critical. We realize that by telling stories, we can tilt the way in which the national collection is perceived, and we're aware that we have a great responsibility here to make sure that what we offer is trustworthy, but at the same time, we need to give people the ability to discover artworks, not just read our stories. And from that point of view, we know we need to do a lot more in terms of tagging artworks. And also, a project that we're working on at the moment is looking at titles that could be viewed as offensive or that are plainly racist. So in terms of the sharing, it's all about stories, it's about inclusivity, it's about trustworthiness, discoverability, and encouraging curiosity. And very finally, just in terms of agency, for us, this is incredibly important, because here we are, guardians of an online national collection, which brings with it responsibilities. We're not a publicly owned body, we're a registered charity, we're not particularly aligned, we're not aligned to any particular institution. So the museums and the galleries are key stakeholders. They need to have governance in what we do, and they do at all levels, and help guide our direction. Partnerships help amplify those voices, and partnerships with academics are very, very important to us. Artists are on the board, but giving them more involvement, giving artists agency over what we do is something of great interest to us. But really critical is the audience, the owners of this wonderful public collection. Obviously, we make use of audience research, audience panel, but most importantly for us is giving the audience that agency over the national collection. So in other words, it's not just about access, but it's about contributing to it, contributing in valuable projects such as tagging, our Art Detective project, which puts collections in touch with expert knowledge amongst the general public across the world. And Hammad's project is called Curating Nation. We give the public the opportunity to curate their own exhibitions on Art UK. Agency also extends to open access. I'm not completely convinced by that, and I'm worried that open access in some ways can inhibit some of the other things that we're trying to do. There are lots of other ways we can give public agency, but one of the greatest things that we really want to encourage is to encourage them to go and see the real thing, because as we said at the start, we are just a digital reflection of that. So I hope that's given you some sense of our vision, how we work, our challenges, but also I think, optimistically, the great opportunities here. There's lots more we can discuss around the economics, how do you sustain this, growing collections, technology, and we're always very keen to hear from people about how we can improve what we're doing.
Thanks so much, Andy. That's again another very, very rich response. Sarah will now respond to Anne, Marguerite and Andrew, and draw on her own experiences and reflections in her role as CEO at Birmingham's Museums Trust. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Alice. I'll try and be a bit brief because I think we're running slightly behind time. That was all really interesting. Lots of kind of juicy food for thought there. I think I just wanted to fling in a couple of kind of brief provocations in response to that. Firstly, Andrew's point about nationhood and kind of who cares in the sense, like, do researchers when they're looking for collections care whether they're private collections or public collections? I just wanted to sort of put a pin in that and remember that these questions of nationhood and sort of designated collections and nationally significant collections, in some senses, although obviously it's very important what is designated and nationally significant in terms of money and kind of core establishment, traditional canonical collections and all the rest of it, I think it's worth just putting in the room that the significant collections and sort of sense of nationhood, just to remind ourselves that visitors, the public, art enthusiasts, people engaging with art are not, like, in many ways they are not thinking in that way through that particular prism. It is a very sort of top-down construction. And just for my part, I suppose when I think about what is nationally significant and national collections and nationally significant work going on, I suppose, I was looking for where is the nationally significant work going on around decolonising, for instance, and I wasn't finding that in our national galleries. That was not sort of cutting edge, innovative work that forms our sense of nationhood. I was looking for it, but I wasn't seeing it in those places. And, that already gives us a sense of, a bit of a gap there about what is nationally significant and who decides that. And it's not just about the collections, but what's happening to those collections and the curation of them. So, for example, when I went to Birmingham, I felt that there was space there even back in 2017 to do nationally significant work that I think was stymied and constrained in places like national galleries that were not kind of really taking those risks and being bold and thinking kind of ambitiously enough. They weren't thinking about nationhood in a really serious and profound way, and that in a place like Birmingham there was more space because the version of society and the nationhood and the more convivial multiculturalism that Birmingham strives for as a city was present and infused the collection over the decades. The kind of artists who are represented in the collection meant that that was, for me, a truer version of nationhood. To me, as a British Asian person, looking for that home, looking for that sense of nationhood, this was an alternative nationhood than the one that I was starting to get used to in London, in the white liberal cultural sector that I was moving in, both as a professional and increasingly personally. And then in Birmingham, I found another version of nationhood, and I was like, you know what, that version of nationhood suits me better, personally, individually, and professionally. So now that we are running things like Decolonising research project into the pre-Raphaelites, that came out of work that was happening back in the day, like, you know, 5-6 years ago, which was in turn coming on the back of work that had been going on for decades in places like Birmingham. So that, what might be considered in traditional terms, pre-Raphaelite collection, we say, like a lot of regional museums say, we've got the best this in the world, we've got the best that in the world. Apparently we have the most important pre-Raphaelite collection in the world. But, you know, it's the fact that that is both a nationally significant collection in the most traditional and kind of, you know, art historical sense, but it's more interesting that what we're doing is looking at decolonising that collection in a way that, you know, basically more national museums should be doing. And I don't want to just fall into a kind of scrappy regional versus the elitist nationals cliche, but I think there's something really interesting going on in terms of where nationhood gets defined, who's it getting defined by, and who's listening to that, and where the future is. You know, at the moment, when we're thinking about how we're living right now, you know, nationhood, God, I mean, my nationhood is in floor blocks that I've been living in for the last year, and I think everybody probably feels like that. I've been looking for, since I got appointed as a you know, director of an art gallery, I thought I'd better have some better wall hangings and, you know, impressive wall art going on in my backdrops than I had. So I was scoping around for kind of affordable art by contemporary British, Asian and Black British artists. Couldn't find it on our national collections. When you look for the print shops at Tate, you can barely find a single Black British artist. So someone like me, I was better off, this, what you see painted behind me, I was better off looking for a local artist who came and painted that on my wall recently. That is my nationhood, you know, is Haringey M4, because I couldn't find in our national collections the work that I was looking for. Raksha Patel, who I think is on this call, was the saviour, because she had created basically a nationally significant collection on Instagram using a hashtag for British Asian artists. And she was really doing that kind of work from the bottom up. So there are different places for us to look, and that again speaks to the digital piece. Very quickly and finally, what did I want to say about public art and statues? Just going to fling that in, just as a quick coda. That for a lot of people is what they might consider national art, and where the flashpoints have been for us over this last year. So let's not forget to talk about them a little bit in our conversations about public art and national art. That's enough from me.
Wow, that's so fantastic, Sarah. Thank you so much. Can I now invite Anne, Marguerite, Andy to rejoin us in the conversation? And there are a few questions coming in. And as some more of those come in, I thought, if you don't mind, I'll kick off by just wanting to probe a bit more about this issue of what is of national significance, and who decides that. Because it seems to me that the Northern Irish Troubles collection at Wolverhampton is a fantastic example of a nationally important collection. But I'm wondering whether or not this notion of buddying up, with regional galleries buddying up with national institutions that Marguerite mentioned, whether or not that system just lets the big national institutions that Anne listed, whether or not that system lets them off the hook. And actually those national collections held in regional and civic galleries never make it to the national spaces, and what your thoughts of that were. So Marguerite or Anne, if you want to. Would you like to?
Yes, I can sort of come back quickly on that, if you like. So with the Troubles collection, we worked with both the Imperial War Museum and National Museums of Northern Ireland, of course, which is another national museum, and I think it's a really fruitful partnership when it's truly collaborative, and that there's willingness on the part of all three organisations to work together and to benefit mutually from that partnership. I think sometimes national programmes happen, don't they, that are funded national programmes, and they're often led by national museums, and then the national museums go out to find the partners. And so my experience, I would say, is that it's been more fruitful where those partnerships have evolved over a longer period of time, and that there's a sort of equity within that partnership as well. That's just our experience really in Wolverhampton of working on some of those programs.
I could probably add, I mean, going back to something I think Marguerite said earlier, there's a lot more evidence of museums working together, either sharing works of art or sharing groups of work. I know that the Cultural Gift Scheme has had examples of when a group of works have been donated and they've been shared amongst different museums. And I know, obviously I can't speak for Tate anymore, but I know some time ago Tate shared a gift with the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art and Nottingham Castle Museum, depending on who had interest. And yeah, the National Gallery shouldn't be the greedy one that takes everything. So I think there is a lot more collaboration that does go on, and it is rather fruitful.
Great, thank you. If we could go to the questions, there's been one from Sona Datta, who says, institutional diversity is truly dynamic when there is also a diverse board. So while working with communities is desirable and commendable, how much agency is really relinquished to voices beyond the boardroom? And that's perhaps something I've also been thinking about as to we've been talking about working with pre-existing collections, but moving forward, to what extent is it possible or desirable that we relinquish control of who decides what goes into those collections? Would anyone like to step in?
I mean, digital clearly gives the audience more involvement. There's no doubt about that. And I think, from our point of view, as I was trying to stress in my opening remarks, that agency that you give to the public is incredibly important in giving them this sense of ownership over this collection. And I described the ways we're doing it at the moment, but there are obviously other ways in which you could involve the public with individual collections to determine what comes out of store, what is restored, what is bought perhaps in the future. So there are lots of opportunities there. And I have to say, we we're obviously still a relatively small organisation, but with the programmes that we've had in which we've had public involvement, I mean, Art Detective is a wonderful example, which works genially with fantastic contributions from the public, all volunteered contributions, many with great pieces of expert knowledge that are leading to public collections each week getting 50 to 100 updates as to their records, including interesting reattributions, identities of sitters. So I think we're only at the beginning here of how we can involve the public.
Sarah, would you like to?
Yes, I was just reading Sona's question there, and it's, it's sort of my understanding is that's really about, it's about power and who gets to make acquisitions and make those choices, and who are on boards and this business. And I suppose what I think is really interesting, which has slightly haunted me since I first heard about it, was I know in the States they've got a very different model for acquisitions and funding and all the rest of it. But I remember this example coming across that a few galleries were selling work basically by older white dead artists, specifically in order to create acquisitions budgets to buy contemporary work by younger Black artists. And I thought, what would the equivalent of that be like in UK collections? And what would it be? How would it work? Like, disposal is as much an interesting question for us, and how we make space and room for new artworks. Like, Ellen McAdam, when you think about succession planning and diversity in terms of workforce and all the rest of it, Ellen McAdam, the former director of Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, was quite clear in her mind, I think, that she wanted, when she was thinking about succession planning, that she would hope for Birmingham Museum Art Gallery that would have Black and Asian directors follow her to reflect the audience and the population of Birmingham. And when we think about that in terms of the collection, how are we thinking about succession planning and who might be curating and doing that and making those decisions? So Zach and I are now thinking, along with our board and our staff at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, about exactly this question. It's not just, yes, we need people of colour on our board of governors, but how might we more radically transform and radically shake up our thoughts around power and ownership and acquisitions and disposals, which is, I'm throwing that in, I'm lobbing that in there to my colleagues, see if it winds us up a bit, about making room, who has to step and what artworks have to be sort of deprioritized in order to prioritize other types of work. And I think we have to start thinking the unthinkable more, like that example I started with from the States.
Thanks. Yeah, and that speaks really nicely to another question that we've got from Helen Hilliard, who actually asks, how do the speakers view deaccessioning in the context of creating a national collection? And does deaccessioning and acquisition, do they go hand in hand, I suppose? Marguerite?
I think we do have to be brave about deaccessioning, and I think it needs to be part of a sort of careful and detailed collections review. So it's not done on a whim, but it does need to be done. And if you think about how our collections were formed in the past, I was talking about our collections in Wolverhampton and the fact that they were bequests from 3 local industrialists. They just happened to be the sort of stuff that they liked collecting, and so that there is something about going back to those, reviewing what's relevant, especially if there's duplication in collections as well, and that we can go through that process so that we can then better reflect the history of our city. So I think there is that need to take that sort of leap forward in terms of deaccessioning collections and being quite bold about it.
Anne, please.
Yeah, again, just as a point of information, there are very clear guidelines about both accessioning and deaccessioning, and Sarah's correct, they do go together. But it is possible to deaccession within certain parameters to benefit the collection. Selling off the family silver to mend the roof is another matter.
Yeah, I think that's the critical point here, isn't it, really? This concern that deaccessioning equals the sale of a financial asset, which then is used, that money is then used to support the running of the organisation, and that that's we all know is that slippery slope there that we're very concerned about.
Yeah.
It's different around the country, but in a place like Birmingham, where population is almost 50% non-white, it's an absolute nonsense to have the fine art gallery of the region and the city just not even remotely reflecting that, even though we've got some incredible works in the collection in terms of what you will see on display, we have such a big job in terms of the proportion and the shift that needs to be made, that the kind of work that is happening now around reimagining like how curating works is, well, it's a very interesting city and context to be doing that work. Let's just say that we're working, we've used this thing, Occupy White Walls. Don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's a sort of a digital, it's like a game, basically. It's sort of like, think of something like Minecraft, where you can occupy the white walls of a gallery and basically make your own gallery and space. And that, I think, you know, Andrew, I'm sure you're aware of it, but with, you know, through Art UK and you know, the opportunities that we have now to think digitally and playfully, you know, that in a way is an area that we're looking at and thinking, oh, maybe that's the future of, you know, where the juicy new ideas are coming from, essentially. And maybe we should be looking at as much at forums like this and traditional sort of pipelines for art curators and art history and contemporary art and, you know, the sort of art market. We should be at much looking at Raksha Patel's hashtags and Occupy White Walls and these sort of sources of inspiration and ideas. So,
and also just to say that there is precedent, you know, so if we, in the Speech Acts exhibition, one of the collections that we were working with was Cartwright Hall in Bradford. And Bradford had made a political decision that their civic institution must reflect the people who live in that city. And then, so as part of the work that actually one of our speakers, Anjali Dalal Clayton, who's going to be talking later, did was this sort of an audit of the national collections of artists of Asian and African heritage. And in that audit, Bradford had one more work than Tate. It's probably been overtaken by Tate by now. But I think just to underscore the point that Marguerite was making, Bradford still was not a designated collection, even though they were collecting people like Anwar Jalal Shamsa, maybe 30 years before Tate was, or Farah Nizar Zaid, 40 years before Tate was, or Aubrey Williams, you know, several decades before the Tate was. So in terms of thinking about those processes, I think it's a really good challenge that many of you are making to us and sort of the curatorial setup is to, you know, just think about, you know, what mode of choice and decision making do we favor, and how often do we get it right or wrong? You know, if you were to go back and look at those curatorial decisions on what's collected when, it would be interesting to sort of do that as an exercise.
I mean, I think that's something that every generation of curators does, and they look at what their predecessors have done and think, the idiots, how do they miss so much? But I think probably, you know, their successors will also say the same about the current generation. Just occasionally, there are areas where it's absolutely spot on, but on the whole, people miss things because with hindsight, you can see what you've actually missed. And it's probably a condition that you'll get angry with what your sort of predecessors didn't do.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder how much of a commitment do we as art historians, curators, people in the field, how much commitment do we have to the existing canon? Is it something that we should acknowledge or set aside? And you're shaking your head.
I know, it should be challenged constantly, and that's healthy.
Yeah. Marguerite, would you like to?
I'm so sorry, I just missed your last point because I was reading the last question in the chat and getting drawn into it. Could you just say that again?
We're just asking about the extent to which you, for example, as a curator at Wolverhampton, has to be conscious or aware of an existing canon of art history, and is it something that you can just set aside? Is it something that you have to acknowledge? How do you engage with that canon or not engage with it?
I mean, I think it is difficult because, you know, it's true that you don't see, you know, it's often with hindsight that you start to sort of understand the significance of a particular event, you know, that has happened. And I mean, a good example of that in Wolverhampton is around the development of the Black Art Group. and the first exhibition that happened in the early 1980s in Wolverhampton happened because a group of students, including Keith Piper, walked into the gallery one day and asked the curator if they could put on an exhibition, and the curator said yes. Now I can't sort of see that happening today, but anyway, that's maybe another discussion. It's only really in retrospect that we've come to sort of really appreciate and understand the important moment that was in our city, and recognize that really we need to start collecting work by those artists and preserving it, and putting it that within the whole sort of narrative of the history of our city. And we were successful getting some funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund through Collecting Cultures to develop that collection, and it's still evolving, and we're adding to that. So I think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, really, around that constant need to review and think about your collections and what's important at that moment in time.
Could I just butt in with a question, if I may, to connect a couple of points? One, Anne, I think you were very rightly sort of pointing out that that the online experience for most people, or at least increasingly for young people, is coming out of social media, and websites seem quite flat-footed in comparison for most institutions. And as the point that Andrew was making with Art UK, which is that, as what Art UK does, is that it acts as an aggregator anyway. So when you get on to Art UK, and if you look up, Shamsa or Kim Lim or Rashid Arain, you will see the nation's collection of these people. And then it almost becomes irrelevant, because, if you're sitting in St. Just, looking at work that is sitting in Birmingham or in Scotland, it doesn't really matter. And hence, what the digital does is it also challenges this sort of branding model of institutions. This idea, it's our collection or it's our digital strategy, because in a way, and as we've seen in digital space, most of the value is actually taken by the aggregators, so who have the relationship with people. So I wonder if what we can learn from the digital, we can somehow also apply in the physical. I mean, do all these institutions need to compete with this, or is it really just about saying, what do we as a national collection or as an ecosystem need more of right now, and then who should have it?
But you've pushed my button there, Hammad, because the thing is, I come back to that example about the free market and the art market, that, obviously it's an easy shot, but I'm going to take it, the digital utopia and all of that. But the vast majority of people are in their homes. They're, let's even just say the broad middle class, right? Let's move beyond the sort of art gallery going public, the tiny slither of society that is that. They're getting their art from like M&S and Habitat Wall Art. That's like where the big sales are.
IKEA is the biggest provider of art.
There you are. And all of that is Occupy White Walls is all good for us, and Art UK is a brilliant website. I don't take anything away from it. But the sheer force of market forces and the way that the art market works means, the sort of the social media and the energy that we might get through that is not shifting the fact that the only Black artist you'll find at Habitat is Basquiat, and that is also as much about the nation's collections, and that's not a British artist. So you've pushed my buttons right there. It's something that frustrates me quite a lot, and obviously, like, I can't show off and say that if you look at our prints website, our print shop at Birmingham, we are not doing any better yet. We've just started selling prints online, affordable art, and that's the pre-Raphaelite. So we've got a lot of work to do and a lot of opportunity there as well.
And I think that this conversation. So Anne, did you want to add?
I mean, just briefly, that yeah, especially during lockdown, I'm sure I'm not the only person who enjoyed Instagram a lot, in that especially museums putting out images of the collection, it was a selection that was far more diverse than allowed that to be possible. And I think perhaps websites are more of a tool so that you can access the information that you need, but social media can do a lot more with that. You can sort of select your own collection. And I think during lockdown, when everyone was missing the experience of seeing actual art, there were some really surprising and wonderful selections coming through social media.
And this relates to a question that's come in from Simon Banos, who's wondering about, reflecting on the term national and its geographical aspects, how has the interconnectivity and borderless perception of the world stemmed by the social media culture influenced what national means? And he also wonders how that might influence the way we curate exhibitions in museums. Can you see a moment where social media or Instagram might help inform curatorial choices?
I think it probably already does, because it is a great snapshot on what works of art are actually incredibly popular, and that information gets fed back into the museum.
Marguerite?
I think what social media has really enabled us to do, which for me is one of the most exciting ways that the job has changed in the last 20 years or so, is that it enables us to engage with our audiences in a much more direct way and to have that conversation with them through social media that we weren't able to do before. And so I think that can really, help to shape your program and your acquisitions as well, and to get a much better understanding of your audience. And I really enjoy that part of it, actually.
Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
I think we mustn't forget that it's really incumbent on those of us who have our hands on the levers of all this, the mechanisms from deep within the state. We have to be very actively dismantling the barriers there in terms of those kind of influences and those opinions and that kind of people power that you're talking about, the netizens that are out there. That can all just be bubbling away completely in parallel, while if we are not really actively dismantling the kind of bridges for that power and that influence to kind of get into our actual, who's spending the money on what acquisitions and who's got their hand on the, on the acquisitions budget and which choices are being made. And that we're still an incredibly long way away from that. I mean, I know it would, God forbid I do a panel conversation or talk in which I don't name check museum detox. One of these days it's going to happen, maybe 10 years from now, but there's a lot of museum detox people I can see on the chat and stuff. And I just know the work that goes on internally, still the incredible frustrations that, we have as a collective, trying to dismantle just the most basic things about who our curators are, who are making these choices, who's getting which jobs, who's getting onto which PhD programs. In this day and age, we're still having to use tools like, at the moment, it's great to see that at the moment Tate has got a positive action PhD research project into decolonising art and so forth. And it's sort of, on the one hand, it's so brilliant and I'm so delighted to see it. In other words, when I say positive action, for anybody who doesn't know what I'm referring to, that those studentships are reserved for people of colour. But at the same time, it's like, God, we still need this, in the 21st century, in a sophisticated, supposedly country like this. And let's face it, a lot of the reason why people have tuned into this conversation about nationhood and art is partly because of the culture war stirred up by Oliver Dowden's statements. And, that's a reality on the one hand, so I suppose I'm just talking out loud to myself here, giving myself a good talking to, because I'm a power broker now and have to do this, responsible for buck stops here. But, you know, it's just, that's the truth of it. There's a huge still amount of old-fashioned anti-racist practice that has to go on to dismantle those things so that nationhood starts to even barely reflect what nationhood feels like on the ground.
What more, Sarah, do you think Art UK can do here?
Oh. Well, as you know, I'm a huge fan of some of the editorial work that particularly I've seen over the last couple of years. Some of those gorgeous blog posts by Ferren Gibson and, you know, interesting sort of slices through are brilliant. More help with diversifying those artists and anything that you can do around the sort of who's getting sold and who's getting seen. You know, just like
who's getting seen. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And, you know, you talked about the NMDC earlier, the National Museum Directors Council. They love Andrew. They're all over you, Andrew, and Art UK. They're absolutely championing your work. So you've really got their ear. So really get in there.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is again from Sonodata. In academia, postcolonial studies has been a significant field of inquiry for decades. Why do our panelists think that decolonisation has only just become a priority for public-facing institutions? And how can we properly embed and sustain it?
As I was saying earlier, I think, you know, from our point of view, this touches on what Sarah was just saying. You know, the storytelling is really, really critical, and amplifying those marginalized voices, you know, telling those suppressed stories. And I really, you know, I think there's a lot of fantastic academic work that is being done that is probably shared just with academics. And I think researchers need to look to platforms such as Art UK, to the museums themselves, to be able to relate their research in a way that is a compelling story to the mainstream audience. And the more we can do that, I think that's going to have significant impact.
There's certainly something about a moment, isn't there, of many things coming together, particularly last year, you know, with COVID and the death of George Floyd and what was happening in Bristol around the Colston statue, which I think, you know, hasn't necessarily, you know, driven that debate, which has been going on for, you know, many years, but it's something about now is a moment that actually we just can't ignore it anymore as museums. And I think for me, that feels the reason why there is such a lot of momentum behind it just now.
But I also think one shouldn't forget that there are so many decades to catch up on. Yeah. I think there's been a lot of academic research that's been feeding into acquisitions in museums and galleries for quite a long time, but there's just so much to catch up on. It's just taking too long.
And I'm wondering on this of perhaps disconnect but in time, just thinking about our conversation about acquisitions, and someone earlier in our conversation talked about what gets shown on the walls. And I'm wondering about this, the relationship between acquisitions and display, because building a collection and displaying a collection are two different things. And sometimes there's very little point saying, oh, we're building a fantastic collection if it never gets shown, or it only gets shown in a particular way. And I was wondering if our speakers could say something to that about the relationship between acquisition and display.
I mean, I should imagine in a smaller gallery and museum, the relationship is much, much closer. Even in the national museums, it tends to be the same curators who are working on acquisitions who also work on displays. But acquisitions have a very sort of clear policy for every year, and displays need to perform also many different functions. And yeah, with grants reducing, the ability to change displays often enough is sometimes hampers things. And the changing nature of the collection can't be reflected as swiftly as it should be.
Yeah, and perhaps Andy, this is where somewhere like Art UK, if there's a swift turnaround in uploading those images, those new acquisitions onto Art UK, then they can be available much more quickly on Art UK than perhaps they would be on the physically on the gallery wall.
And obviously they can be talked about as they come onto the site, but the real issue is around their discoverability afterwards. Because as you'd imagine, there is a very long tail of artworks that are not seen or not seen regularly online. And I think one of the challenges for an organisation like us, and indeed for the collections themselves with online platforms, is to keep surfacing those and making them discoverable. And that's why one thing I talked about earlier is this issue around tagging of artwork, so you can tag them by subject matter. So because the actual the tombstone information that comes from the collection is title, artist, dimensions, or whatever. That doesn't really help very much if you're interested in finding out about a particular interest to you or subject matter. So for us, that discoverability and improving that is a key focus, but takes money, and money that we don't have.
Can we actually talk about money? Because when we say the national collection, and then suddenly you have edicts as to what politicians expect from national museums or what museums would do, is there a conversation to be had as to, well, what you as sort of museum directors expect from people making demands to how much do you have to pay if you have to listen to you? So, that conversation of who gets to pay or who has to pay for something that belongs to the nation. And a little bit of what we've seen is that there's a kind of a privatization of cost, but a public control over what gets shown and of the discursive sphere. How do you contest that?
It must have been a hell of a lot easier in, say, the mid-20th century, when the equation was much more equal. Government paid for mostly the museums and their acquisitions budgets, and they were public. The fact that it's now entirely tilted in a different direction is kind of a difficult one. And it's a really good question.
Sarah, Marguerite, do you like to? Or Andy?
Well, for us, I mean, it's been a matter of survival, as many of you on this call know. It's been very, very, very challenging surviving, and this is about the running costs, paying for the core running costs of the organisation. Now, today, we're in a much better situation than we have been in the past, which is fantastic. But I think it's very interesting listening to some of these Towards a National Collection presentations about the amount of money that's been put into Europeana, that's been put into the German Digital Library, which I think gets, if I remember rightly from my notes this morning, €7 million a year to run that. For us, finding that regular funding certainly from the public sector has been challenging. Arts Council obviously is generous, but I think there is, what we need to do is, we haven't succeeded in doing, is convincing people that it actually costs more to do this well. But the actual value, the economic, the value for money is extraordinary. If you were to divide our average running costs across all the venues on the site, it works out at something like just over £300 per year per venue. And this beauty of the sharing of digital infrastructure, unlike a storeroom, an art room storeroom, collections in Aberdeen and St Ives can share a digital infrastructure. They can't share a storeroom. So there is wonderful economic efficiencies here in doing it this way, and it just spreads scale and technology across collections large and small. So we're still making that case for, you know, the money that one needs to do this properly and have impact. We our paid advertising in the last year, the amount of money, well, obviously we get a Google grant, which is free to do advertising, but it was under £1,000 per month. Under £1,000 per month is the paid advertising that we did to promote this national collection. So I mean, it is a challenge, but I'm optimistic that it's going to get better.
Hammad, could you sort of say the question again, because it sounded really interesting, but I slightly didn't understand it. And remember, I haven't really got an art history background, so
let me rephrase it, and maybe I'll sort of channel my inner yes minister. So is it a question of the museum sector being courageous in terms of the political demand that they make? So who should fund, you know, the national collection or the museum as a public resource? You know, is it really just a one-way field, that we've taken this idea that public culture is being privatized and we're going to run with it?
Can you say more about what you mean by public culture has been privatized?
Yeah,
I think I know what you mean.
I think if I understand Hammad correctly, it goes back to what Anne was saying in her talk about this model where galleries and museums generate income through ticket sales and through the shop, and that sort of privatization of, so you can go to the Tate, but if you want to see the Tate exhibition, you have to pay.
And through philanthropy. And so 70% of the running costs, say, for a National Museum have to be raised through income other than what is given by government. And that was obviously not so very many decades ago, closer to 100%.
Yes, and I think like the old kind of little half-dead little Marxist in me sort of waking up and thinking, yet the means of production here have been undisrupted for quite a long time. And what we've seen in this last year, this basically socialism by our conservative government, has made us all think again, I hope, about what really is possible. And when we say there's no money for stuff and there's no magic money tree, turns out there was a magic money tree. It's just actually how we make those choices, and as you say, what we lobby for. And sometimes I think, I wish Zach was here. And this is one of those times, because he's got a commercial background. And as you can imagine, we have some pretty interesting, I hope, questions about some of the new kind of approaches and solutions that we might make to these questions, respond to these questions of cultural democracy, by also digging into the kind of cultural enterprise, the enterprise model, basically the as you described it, the kind of broken model that we're kind of limping along with, of like, we've got these incredible public collections that taxpayers are paid for, but over here they're basically getting, you know, we're basically subscribing to, as you say, the kind of blockbuster exhibition model, where we kind of like doing this slightly crappy bolt-on privatized bit over here that doesn't even work that well. I mean, let's face it, it doesn't even make that much money. It's not even a great way of, you know, if you're going to shill out your stuff, it's not even that good. So I haven't got the answer, but I think I've understood the question. Sorry for blathering out and taking the last few minutes, but I think I get what you're saying, and I think basically there might be a little bit of Marxist art historian response is probably my sense. She furiously Googles after the panel.
Can I just come in from yeah, if I just come in, because we're just a small regional museum in Wolverhampton, and I think there's a bit of the pragmatist in me as well, that you do have to understand your political context that you're working in. And I mean, we've never had that kind of business model where we can put on the big blockbuster, you know, Leonardo exhibition and make lots and lots of money. And we've always had to be quite sort of strategic. I mean, even going back to the 1960s when David Rogers was collecting work by Warhol, etc., you know, about where we go to for funding. But we do sort of, it's quite effective to actually get the politicians on side about what actually culture can do for the city, you know, in terms of the visitor economy, improving health and well-being and all of those things. And whilst I welcome Hammad challenging us to push back, I think actually the collaborative side of it can be also quite powerful.
I would say, just, you know, in terms of, we are very happy, I'm very happy with the mixed funding model. I mean, I think there should be, you know, public support, but also it is very important to go to the private sector support. And I think, you know, we work in a very, very collaborative way. So.
Great, thank you all so much for such a stimulating conversation. Apologies to those in the audience if I didn't get to your question. I'm going to try and hold them over to the next session, and there are some interesting ones that I think will relate really nicely to what our speakers will be talking to about after the break. This afternoon we're going to hear 2 proposition papers which were sent in by our speakers as a result of our call for papers for this event. Anjali Dalal Clayton will present her paper titled "Our Civic Collections Are Our National Collection." It's a bit of a mouthful, but Anjali is an art historian who focuses on British artists of African and Asian descent. She completed her PhD at Liverpool John Moores University with a thesis titled "Coming into View, Black Artists and Exhibition Cultures, 1976 to 2010, and was a researcher on the UAL's Black Artists and Modernism project led by Professor Sonia Boyce. She's currently based at UAL's Decolonising Arts Institute, where, as a research fellow, she's conducting research on museums, collecting, and interpretation practices. She's also a co-investigator on the Tate-led project Provisional Semantics, addressing the challenges of representing multiple perspectives within an evolving digitized national collection, which focuses on how museums and heritage organizations can engage in decolonizing practices to produce search terms, catalogue entries, and interpretations fit for purpose for an evolving digitized national collection. And I'm sure Anjali will have lots to say about what we've just been talking about. Following Anjali, I'm delighted that Ingrid Pollard and Corinne Fowler will present their paper exploring Britain's colonial countryside, co-curation, creative commissions, and child leadership. Corinne Fowler is Professor of Postcolonial Literature at the University of Leicester, and her work addresses the legacies of colonialism in representations of British history, with a particular focus on rural Britain's colonial connections. Her most recent book is a critical creative study called Green Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural Britain's Colonial Histories, which is published by Peepaltree Press of 2020. She's currently leading the Colonial Countryside National Trust Houses Reinterpreted project. This Colonial Countryside project is a child-led history, writing project which works with 100 primary school pupils, 11 National Trust houses, 10 commissioned writers, and 9 historians of empire. It takes a devolved look at the links of country houses and their collections to the East India Company and the British Atlantic world, and has already produced curriculum change in 63 schools. The renowned artist Ingrid Pollard is the commissioned photographer for the Colonial Countryside project. Pollard studied film and video at the London College of Printmaking, photographic studies at the University of Derby, and received her PhD from the University of Westminster. She has been exploring the relationship between rural race and the British countryside for decades, and you may be familiar with her works Pastoral Interlude from 1998, which is in the V&A collection, and the Wordsworth Heritage series of 1992, which was exhibited on billboards across the UK. In 2016, she became an honorary fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, and in 2018 was the inaugural Stuart Hall Fellow at the University of Sussex. And I'll put links to Ingrid's website in the chat. But first off, Anjali, would you like to share your screen and let's continue with this wonderful conversation?
Sure, yeah. So hi everyone, and before I start, a massive thanks to Hammad, Alice, Lizzie and Marlene. Thanks for having me today. The discussion so far have been really, really interesting, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the programme over the coming weeks. My presentation today is about civic art museums and galleries and the important but understudied and undervalued role they've played in developing narratives of British art. Questions about what constitutes British culture and British art and how our public institutions respond to those questions take on different significances in moments of political and cultural change, such as the one we're in now, in the midst of Brexit, the so-called culture wars, and the global pandemic. The travel restrictions we've experienced this past year have arguably made us more reliant on the cultural provision of our local municipalities. Indeed, we needn't go far to enjoy great art. Important artworks are stored and shown in the museums and galleries in our town centres. And while institutions with a designated national remit have, in my opinion, struggled with the weighty task of developing collections of art that are both for and representative of the diverse population of the UK, our regional, or as I prefer to say, our civic museums and galleries have over several decades quietly advanced a more diverse and more representative set of narratives about British art to those offered by the better funded and more revered nationals. So, focusing on the exhibition and collecting histories of civic museums and galleries in the north of England, and particularly how British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage featured in them between the 1980s and 90s, I'm going to reflect on the agency afforded by a regional status, the impact of that agency on the selection of artists and artworks for inclusion in collections and exhibitions, and the narratives of British art that emerge as a result. And what I hope to show is that we don't need to look further than the sometimes locally focused collections and politically engaged programs of our so-called regional museums and galleries for expanded, nuanced and representative narratives of British art, and therefore that we shouldn't think of our national collection as being held solely by our national art institutions, but also as residing in and across the collections of our civic museums and galleries. And I'm going to start with a whistle-stop tour of the northwest of England and the exhibition histories of the public or civic galleries of Liverpool, Preston, Rochdale and Manchester. And as I said, focusing specifically on how artists with African, Asian and Caribbean heritage feature in them during the 80s and 90s. And I'm starting in the 80s because before this time, artists with these backgrounds weren't shown in significant numbers unless they were included in exhibitions that explicitly framed them as being foreign. So, for example, exhibitions of Caribbean art or Indian art or Chinese art, which sometimes included British-born or British-based artists who'd rarely or even never set foot in those regions of the world. So it was really only from the early 80s that the notion that there might be artists who were both Black and British or British Asian really started to be acknowledged by our public institutions. And because I don't have much time, I'm not going to name or speak about all the exhibitions, but instead try and use the slides to indicate their numerousness across the 2 decades visually. And I wrote about these shows for the online culture magazine, The Double Negative, last year, and I'll put a link to that in the chat afterwards for anyone who wants to read more about this exhibition's history. And so we'll start with the Bluecoat in Liverpool, because it was probably the first Northwestern arts venue to stage an exhibition focusing specifically on work by Black British artists with its 1985 show, Black Skin Bluecoat. It's thanks to this exhibition and the relationships it developed with the artists in it that the Bluecoat developed a rich multi-ethnic programme in the following decades, including important exhibitions such as Trophies of Empire and Independent Thoughts, as well as several solo shows. And it's the solo shows that really made it an exemplar of good curatorial practice compared to many of the more prominent art institutions situated further south and in the capital, where one-person shows for what we might now call artists of colour were much rarer. And next up is Rochdale Art Gallery, which played a significant role in supporting Black women artists and Black feminist art practice in the late 1980s and 90s. So in 1987, Rochdale invited Lubaina Hamid to present a solo show of her work there, accompanied by another exhibition involving a collaboration with the artist Maud Salter. As had happened at Bluecoat, these two exhibitions prompted a long relationship between Rochdale Art Gallery and the two artists, resulting in 10 exhibitions organised by them over the course of 8 years, which supported the careers of several Black women artists who would later become major players in British art, not least Hamid herself. Hamid moved to Preston in 1991 to work at the University of Central Lancashire, and so it's perhaps no coincidence, given her impact in Rochdale, that Preston's Harris Museum also became a significant arts venue for showcasing work by artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage in the 1980s and 90s. This series of exhibitions at the Harris, combined with Hamid's subsequent work at UCLan, including her Making History's Visible archive and co-directorship of the university's Institute for Black Atlantic Research, have made Preston an important site for Black British art history. The city of Manchester has also been important in this respect, and especially Corner House, now known as Home. Several exhibitions took place at Corner House in the 1980s and 90s, most notably the groundbreaking exhibition, The Other Story, which was devised by artist Rashida Reen and sought to present a new narrative of British modernism through its focus on artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage. It toured to Manchester in 1990 after its initial display at the Hayward Gallery in London the previous year and took place across both Corner House and Manchester Art Gallery. Now, the exhibitions listed in the last few slides represent only a small proportion of the programmes of the venues mentioned, and none of them, apart from The Other Story, explicitly put forward a narrative of British art, new or otherwise. Furthermore, one might argue that many of them were problematic because they allowed exclusionary narratives of British art to remain intact by separating work by British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage out from their white contemporaries. However, the fact that these exhibitions happened at all is important because of their implicit acknowledgement of these artists as being British. And by this I mean the shows were largely focused on practice and content rather than on the artist's ethnic or cultural origin as indicators of their supposed non-Britishness. This, combined with the fact that the shows were taking place in British publicly funded art institutions, meant that they implicitly put forward an expanded narrative of British art, one that included artists whose recent heritage lies beyond Britain. So I'm suggesting that by simply including such exhibitions in their programmes, these civic institutions were saying, these artists are part of the story of British art. Now, it's important to consider why these sorts of exhibitions first started to be seen in civic museums and galleries rather than in the nationals. We know that The Other Story wasn't staged at the Hayward Gallery until the very end of the 1980s, and that it took Irene 11 years of campaigning to make that happen. And across the 90s and 2000s, there were really no notable exhibitions in national institutions that positioned artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage in contexts of British art, apart from a handful of solo shows for select art world favourites such as Steve McQueen, Chris O'Feely or Anish Kapoor. And the British Art Show, which is of course a touring show, but carries a similar status to exhibitions staged in national venues due to its links with Hayward Gallery and the Arts Council. So I would argue that it's really only in the past 10 years that we've begun to see a curatorial consideration of such artists' contributions to the canon of British art. And even then, that consideration isn't usually substantial. So what was it that enabled the civics to engage with work by such artists in a British art context more quickly than the nationals or even at all? In my view, it's to do with their obligation to engage in and respond quickly to socio-political developments. The founding principles of many civic art institutions were to foster civic pride and support the cultural and economic growth of the town or city. And this aim still remains in present-day mission statements, expressed in terms of social cohesion and well-being, and also in terms of nurturing and providing a platform for emerging local artists. And although you'll also now see an increased ambition to exhibit and collect work by nationally and internationally renowned artists, that centering of local communities and local concerns is what continues to distinguish them from national museums and galleries. And it's this focus on issues of local concern or on the nuances of national issues at a civic level that I think prompted civic art institutions to engage with work by British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage on a scale never seen before. And one of the key triggers was the inner city uprisings that occurred between 1981 and 1984 that were primarily prompted by unjust policing, economic inequality and racial discrimination. These uprisings led some staff working in civic art institutions to begin showing work that directly addressed the issues that prompted them. Speaking at the conference in 2012, Mike Tooby, who became keeper of the Mappin Art Gallery in Sheffield in 1984, explained that, quote, local authority-run services in Northern England and the Midlands in the early 80s had, in governance terms at least, a sense of ownership, which seemed to offer more centrality than the studied alternatives of national and contemporary art spaces. It was impossible to work for the city art galleries and not address the political life of the community. At the Mappin, we saw our civic role as creating projects that were locally relevant and specific, often to the disadvantage of the perception of their significance beyond Sheffield and the north of England. The year that Tooby began working at the Mappin, he staged the UK's first survey exhibition of work by British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage in a publicly funded arts venue. It was titled Into the Open, indicating that the artists were being introduced to the public and art world for the first time. Recalling his thoughts about the show at the time, Tooby stated, quote, on one hand, I saw it as a component of this question of the social ordering of art, of the civic role of an art gallery, a demand for art and its institutions to reflect and respond what was going on in the world around us. However, what became immediately apparent was that the art itself was the product of a very powerful and specific momentum. Speaking to me about the impact of the uprisings on his work at Bluecoat, long-standing artistic director Brian Biggs similarly explained, quote, we couldn't ignore it. The political situation was very volatile. It was still quite raw a few years after the Toxteth riots in Liverpool. My own political conviction meant that I couldn't just ignore all that stuff. It wasn't a time for keeping art in a vacuum. All this other stuff was going on, and you couldn't ignore that, especially in a city like Liverpool that was bearing the brunt of a lot of those Thatcherite policies. So the Mappins Into the Open and the Bluecoats, Black Skin Bluecoat, were two of the first exhibitions to focus on practices of British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage in publicly funded arts venues in the 1980s. Neither would have been possible without that civic imperative to engage via their programs in the socio-political issues and events that were impacting the citizens of the surrounding areas, nor without that element of operating slightly under the radar or being perceived by the centres of power as provincial and thereby less important or influential. Indeed, the sustained engagement with Black feminist practices that occurred at Rochdale Art Gallery over the course of a decade would never have been possible at a national art museum or gallery without it being accused of being imbalanced. Evidently, civic art institutions in the northwest of England have been pivotal in supporting British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage through exhibitions. And although their collections aren't as representative of the ethnic diversity of the region as they should be, data from my audit of public collections for the Black Artists in Modernism project showed that, generally speaking, civic institutions were collecting work by such artists in greater quantities and much sooner than the nationals. And again, I believe this is a consequence of their civic focus and regional status. A key example is that of Cartwright Hall Art Gallery in Bradford, which, as Hammad mentioned earlier, the collection contains more works by British artists with African, Caribbean and Asian heritage than Tate's collection of British art. Research by Dr. Pamela Crawford revealed that Bradford's impressive collection was the result of both an awareness of the contribution the gallery could make to easing social unrest in the aftermath of the early 1980s uprisings, of which Bradford was also a site, and a commitment to serving the needs of both the immediate and surrounding population of Bradford. This was spearheaded by committed and visionary individuals who saw the potential for developing Bradford's own collection and who ensured that active collecting of works by contemporary and historical artists of South Asian descent was written into local government policy. One of the key protagonists in this particular collecting history was Dr. Nima Purveyor Smith, who, as Cartwright Hall's curator between 1986 and 1998, was largely responsible for the growth of the collection in this direction. In a recent interview, she explained that her thinking at the time was that, quote, if these works are not captured in public collections, then there's going to be a huge distortion of history. It wasn't pioneering to collect this work, it was common sense. The cases of Bluecoat in Liverpool, the Mappin Art Gallery in Sheffield, and Cartwright Hall in Bradford are only 3 examples of civic institutions responding quickly to socio-political developments and to the needs of local audiences or stakeholders in a way that national institutions were not. And I'm certain there are parallel examples of this happening in other regions of Britain. For some, like the Bluecoat, which doesn't have a collection, this manifested in programming, and for others like Cartwright Hall, it was evident in the collecting activity. And so it's on this basis that I propose that it's in and across our many civic institutions that we may find a national collection built in response to social, political, and cultural shifts as they happen, rather than when those shifts are firmly secured in history. Furthermore, it's in this way that civic institutions have been quietly shaping a narrative of British art that's arguably more reflective or representative of the nation than that offered by our officially designated national institutions. Different constructions of Britishness are being developed all the time and in all sorts of different arenas. Some are expressed more loudly than others, and in my view, it's about which ones we choose to pay attention to, because the national story of art might become more diverse and representative of who we are as a nation if we look at the narratives that are evolving in our local civic spaces.
Thank you so much, Anjali. That was brilliant. I'm sure there's going to be loads of questions coming out of that. For those of you in the audience, please hold on to your questions for the moment, because we're going to turn straight away to our next speakers, Ingrid Pollard and Corinne Fowler, and their paper, Exploring Britain's Colonial Countryside, Co-Curation, Creative Commissions and Child Leadership. So Ingrid and Corinne, would you like to share your screen?
While Ingrid's sharing the screen, I'll just explain that Ingrid's got a PowerPoint of some of the photographs that she took while she was working on the Colonial Countryside project with us. And that's going to go round in a loop, hopefully, technology permitting. And yeah, I mean, while that's happening, I just wanted to mention that I was pleased to see in separate context both Sarah and Anjali talking about the importance of the devolved focus. And certainly in terms of the history of empire, a local focus really allows the fuller history of empire to come out in all its detail and complexity. I think it's already been mentioned earlier on what Colonial Countryside is, but it's fundamentally a child-led history and writing project, and it's guided by a team of historians who've worked on projects like the Legacies of British Slave Ownership, the East India Company at Home project, and also the we've got an historian who wrote Black Tudors. So they're people sort of at the forefront of work in this area. And the aim really was to make country houses' connections to empire more widely known. And I think that aim was certainly met, although because of the culture wars, slightly more painfully than perhaps we had anticipated. As a linked work with Colonial Countryside, a report I co-edited with a number of National Trust curators about the colonial links of National Trust houses. It got a lot of public attention, and it dragged this project, unfortunately, into the culture war. But I won't talk too much about that because we've got very little time and there are the two of us speaking. But basically a group of common sense, what they call themselves, common sense group, Conservative MPs and peers, caused quite a lot of a noise and a lot of trouble about this, including asking the Charity Commission to investigate the National Trust for researching its own history. setting off a couple of parliamentary debates about the future of the National Trust and the report and so on. But I sort of want to move swiftly on from that right now and talk about some elements of the project which we perhaps know less about. So one of them is the commissioning aspect. So there are 10 writers who were commissioned to write about 10 of the National Trust houses, and that will be published as a book soon. But also Ingrid's work. She went on every single visit to the National Trust houses that we did, with 100 pupils in total, and she photographed the pupils during these visits. And you can see some of these images on the slides behind you as I talk. And the one that you can see there is Penrhyn Castle, which is in North Wales. And the history of that castle is basically that the family-owned plantations for hundreds of years in Jamaica, in the Denbigh sugar plantations in Clarendon, and that money paid for the castle, the opulent furnishings and decorations and stonework inside, and also the estate, but also the local Penrhyn slate mine. So it's very connected to local industrial history as well. And just to sort of, I'll hand over to Ingrid to talk a bit more about her experience of working with the particular children we took to Penrhyn Castle. But the format of the visit was that the children would look around the castle, as you can see there. They would look at 3 objects in each house, and they would then write poems and short personal essays about them. And these children co-curated an exhibition, which is still in Penrhyn Castle there. And one of the poems that they wrote, which is very impressive for a 10-year-old, he had money, I had history, his money stole my history. So I'll hand over to Ingrid to talk a bit more about her work with the children there.
Thanks, Corinne. Yes, as Corinne said, I was doing photography in each of the locations that I went to. I think that, yeah, there were 10 in total. So it was producing work that we used in multiple platforms as a record for Corinne's research, National Trust, with each individual site as well. So it's covering a number of ways of recording the young people's interaction with the sites and with its histories and their workshops. But I was very interested because they were very young children being investigating these particular sites, and some of them which were very controversial and difficult for the children to cope with. But they also had to work with volunteers, they worked with the National Trust, their carers, and of course they were working with themselves. So it was seeing them in a multiple settings, and then in a lunch hour they just become kids again, and they'll be tearing around in the grass, running around, throwing their shoes, I remember, and they'd come back and do very serious work. So it was trying to record all of that, both spontaneously, and then I'd have a series of set up shots that could be worked in a different way, and then negotiating who was going to be in those shots, how it's going to work, and their understanding of what was going on with the photography outside of their work was what I became interested in. How they'd, after a while, sometimes they'd forget I was there, and they'd be, interacting quite intensely with each other and with the historians that we're working with, and then working with the sites they were in. Most of them hadn't been to the sites before, so just understanding and getting around those sites was also something that was to be negotiated. So yeah, that was my interest, how I'd work with the children, having to keep my mouth shut a lot of the time because I wanted to get engaged in the site and talk about it with them, but then I was there to do a specific job. So some of them are, these kind of documentary type images, and some of them is about a sort of slightly different artistic approach, or how they work with the opulence, the magnificence of some of those buildings, and knowing where the money for that came from, and the young students as well were also engaging that. So we're on some sort of similar trajectory together, but my input was very different. So yeah, I was interested in how I could work with them and how they'd work with the sites.
I wanted to, should I talk about Durham Park, Ingrid?
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, this is Durham Park here, which has conveniently come up on the roll as we mentioned it. And Durham Park has a 17th century colonial story of colonial administration, in fact, and it's very connected to the Royal African Company. And there are some really quite sensitive objects in this property, and it will come up soon. There are a couple of 17th century wooden African stands, which Ingrid photographed a small selection there. You can see an enslaved man in chains in a very servile and demeaning position. And some of the children felt very strongly about those stands, and I'm sure Ingrid will mention that later on. But again, they had the same visit format. They worked with two writers, Sarala Estruck, who they wrote poems with, and Malachi McIntosh. But the important thing about the child leadership aspect is that children come up with all kinds of ideas that I certainly couldn't. And on the way back from one of these trips, one of the children had been very kindly bought a guidebook for adults by her teacher. And she was flicking through it saying, I know what all these pictures mean because we've studied these objects, but this is really boring. The text is just not appealing to any child. And so as a result of that, we got a group of children I asked her what she personally would do, and she said she'd draw glasses and moustaches on all the paintings and annotate and so on. So she came up with some great ideas. And as a result of that suggestion, a group of children from colonial countryside then wrote a guidebook by children, for children, commissioning the artist and writing it word by word, and then getting other children to evaluate the old guidebook and the new guidebook to see which one was preferred, and you can guess which one was preferred. I think child leadership has been a very important aspect of this project, and I suspect one of the reasons why it had such resonance and found a way through where many great people in the past have tried to find a way through and not managed. So I think it's also about the children of this generation having connections to the rest of the world in ways that previous generations just don't understand. And so their thinking is perhaps a little more expansive in that sense, that they can make those connections and look at these global collections and places with a different eye and a different perspective. I'll hand over to Ingrid to talk about your experience of working with them at Durham.
I don't know if it was at this institution, there was some opportunities for them to actually work with the volunteers and actually do the tour with them. So they're instructing the adults what's interesting, how can they do it. So there was something about instruction with disturbing subjects with the young adults that sort of negotiation and learning a different story about the site the volunteer might have been working with for years, that there's some of that very definite ideas about the places they were able to change or look at it differently. There was a certain acceptance without it being a kind of demeaning because they're children, because the children have very different ideas and that they know that their research, the students have done their research, certainly been there and talked it and did their own writing. But at Durham, there was that particular statue of that enslaved person, a very demeaning attitude as well. And some of the students had a very big, very disturbed reaction to it, not wanting to be shown. Was definitely it should not be shown, it should be hidden away, people shouldn't do that. So there's the emotional reaction to some of the work, and some of the detailed things that were just around tiny pictures of or ceramics of sugar making in Jamaica that were there, and they tell us a particular story. But it's often when adults are going around, they'll bypass that or just say that's part of the pictorial collection. Whereas if you start to investigate, it tells a whole different stories that's underpinning how we understand that building and the money that went into it. So as they were researching, it might be a sword as well we're looking at that's connected to the different companies. it's also about slowing down in those particular those particular places, about slowing it down as well. So that when they come to write about it, all that stuff also came out. But there are a lot of disturbances with the adults as well about the material, which was kind of unexpected for me anyway.
Yeah, they're definitely sensitive objects and difficult for the children. Had a discussion about whether or not, as Ingrid said, those particular objects, those African stands, should be on display, which is something which is very much under discussion, isn't it, in so many institutions. When you look at sensitive objects of that nature, you know, how do you deal with them? And there was one child who was quite disturbed by them, but then produced some of the best, most powerful writing of the whole project. Well, what she did was she imagined that she was the person, one of the men in those, which was represented in those African stands, and that she was voicing his thoughts in a piece of narrative fiction. It was absolutely fantastic. But I think the kinds of discussions that they had were surprising given their young age, as Ingrid said, and also the contrast between a group of children running around on the grounds like racehorses and then having really serious philosophical discussions at other times. But I think the really, I was particularly happy with the work that the children did on the guidebook, because they were able to take out and extract the information about the colonial history of a particular place, but bring those stories to life, instruct the artist as to how to make the whole thing more relatable, and also to bring out the human dimensions of those stories. And I think that that's where the creative commissions really came into their own, in that the commissions recognise that there are appalling gaps in the historical record, and that some voices come out far more loudly and clearly and oppressively than others. And so that commission aspect, the artistic aspect, was a way of conferring dignity on those who've been traumatized by history, but also in the sense that they bring to life some stories which can sometimes be quite dry and convoluted and are hard otherwise to relate to. But it was fantastic how the children, for example, looked at a painting of an African page and insisted that the artist they were commissioning put a cartoon version of the boy right in the middle of a painting, because they hated the way that he was put right at the edge of the painting. The child their age, and of course country houses are absolutely full of paintings of fundamentally kidnapped children, which really have resonance for children of the same age for obvious reasons. I think we've reached the end of our time, Ingrid.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was absolutely terrific, and it's so inspiring to see that the project and what it's achieved, and how it's helping reframe these narratives. Anjali, would you like to rejoin the conversation? And if you have questions for Anjali, Corinne, and Ingrid, please do pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. I will start off, because it seems to me that in some ways both of your papers are sort of arguing for a similar thing, which is you're both demonstrating the possibilities and the potentials of these exhibition histories and collection histories to really expand and diversify narratives of nation and nationhood. If only we were looking for them, if only we could think creatively and work with them. So it seems to me not a case of chucking out the old to bring in the new, but actually working with what we have more creatively. I mean, I wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that process.
I think there was a different house. We were, and there was a pair. There were some South Asian sisters who lived there and were part of the family that lived there. And when we were asking about them, they were saying, oh, they didn't have enough information about them, didn't know where to find them, what they were. And I think we opened one drawer, and lo and behold, there was loads of press in just about these two sisters, just in a drawer. They either forgotten about them, or there's some sort of deliberate deflecting going on. So sometimes it's there, but it's not there at the same time. It's kind of hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Whittick Manor. Sorry, just to fill in there, because that was Whittick Manor in the Midlands near Wolverhampton, and it's two Indian sisters who married into the Manda family. And yeah, I'd forgotten that incident with the drawer. They pulled out the drawer, and there's a whole load of newspaper cuttings about these sisters. Fascinating.
Yeah, but it's, I guess it's that issue of the hidden archive, that actually the archival trace can be quite big and tell a really rich story, but no one has bothered to look for it.
Yeah, and for me, I guess that's what I'm trying to surface, and I you know, I'd love to connect with other researchers like yourself, Alice. So you're doing all that in-depth research at Rochdale to surface those histories that are kind of already known by the artists who are involved in them, but because of, you know, poor archiving or just erasure, those histories are not broadly known. And you know, I think if institutions are, you know, I know Sarah said earlier about, you know, are institutions really thinking about, you know, what constitutes, you know, the national story of art or whatever. And yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but if they are thinking about that, and they are thinking, how can we activate our collections differently? How can we devise shows that tell a different kind of story of what British art might be? I think there's a lot of use in going back and looking just, you know, 20, 30, 40, you know, years ago, even just that far, and doing, you know, engaging with research that surfaces exactly what those exhibitions were doing, and the stories that they were trying to generate, and to use that, because I think a lot of those stories are still pertinent now, if not more so. And if they can provide the basis for new ways of doing things, the better, probably.
I mean, I guess as one of those people from 30, 40 years ago that were in some of those exhibitions, sometimes, you know, people approach me to ask about that exhibition or how something happened. And sometimes it feels that's not really the story. It's the stories about what happened to those institutions that people had their work displayed in. How come there's only 3 or 4 artists from that period? What about sickness, exhaustion, people leaving the sector? That's the story that also doesn't get talked about. What's happening? What happens to all those black theatre companies, different art galleries, different ways of working? Yeah, so sometimes it's not. Yeah, I had to ask a different set of questions, different story, really.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd wondered if our panelists from earlier this afternoon would like to join us, Sarah, Andy, Marguerite and Anne, and whether or not you have any responses or any questions you'd like to put to Anjali, Ingrid or Corinne, or Lizzie or Marlene. Do you have anything you'd like to probe further? Anne.
I just totally agree with Ingrid about the questions that need asking. And I remember a piece of research that we did about gender, for example, within Tate's collection, looking at a lot of data from the numbers of women artists who go through art schools, and then those who actually have exhibitions, and then how that proportion is reflected 10 years on. and what happened to those women. And then, of course, looking at ethnicity, the same thing was possible. It's like, why do these people disappear, and why are they not visible after a certain time? And I think with gender, we were very clear that it wasn't because women artists were having children and giving up. There was something else. There was exhaustion was quite a lot of it after being ignored. I think it's a very relevant point.
And I think that's really important to acknowledge that in terms of acquisitions and collection building, particularly when we have museums and institutions making decisions about whether or not to acquire works on the basis of a depth of work or a length of career, and whether or not this artist is established or not. And does the acquisition of one work, is it supported by a weight of literature or knowledge or experience that will support an argument for that this artist is worthy to be in a collection, whether it's a national or a civic one.
And obviously exhibition histories are a huge part of that.
I had a bit of a question for Anjali about her work, actually, for May, which was that I'm also interested in the lineage of sort of Black feminist gallerists and curators and so forth. And I'm sort of very conscious that Rita McLean, her legacy of her work at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery is not always fully, it's not perhaps that well known by young curators working today, and that I sort of want to hear a bit more about about the kind of what's going on to combat that erasure. Obviously your research is part of it, but where these sort of legacies and connections are being made intergenerationally between scholars and curators, because there seems to have been a sort of a bit of a gap, I feel, a sort of like in a 10-year period between maybe the beginning of the noughties, the like 2000 to 2010, when there seemed to be a sort of, the baton seemed to drop a bit. And I say that because I feel like I seem to be somehow in some sort of weird outlier mini generation in between the sort of Instagram millennials and the Rita McLeans, and I sort of feel sometimes like a physical human bridge between these. Could you talk about that a bit?
Classic move. Yeah, I wish I could talk about Rita McLean, and I'm ashamed to say she is a person whose work I don't really know very much about. So, but speaking more generally, yeah, I think you're right. There seems to be this repeated loss of knowledge over time. The knowledge seems to continually be embodied in a way, or it's under people, famously under people's beds, in people's attics. I know Marlene has her own archive, and Ingrid too, and even when the archives of like something like the Panchayat archive, which has a huge wealth of exhibition ephemera, even when it goes into a collection, it still isn't surfaced, it still isn't activated, and so we're just facing this problem over and over again. And with each kind of new mini generation or half generation, everybody's still learning about these histories for the first time. So I only learned about artists of about the Black Art Group, for example, by looking at the Other Story catalogue when I was a student, and I'm hearing that from students now in universities. Students saying to me now, I didn't know that there were any Black or Asian British artists of note until I saw the Black Artists and Modernism documentary. So it seems every generation is learning about these histories for the first time, and I've kind of lost my train of thought now. But in terms of the exhibition making, I think there are pockets of research happening around that. There are people, for example, doing lots of research around what Lubaina Hamid was doing through the 80s and 90s. I know Marlene researches on that herself, even as someone involved as well. And I don't know what more to say about that other than that that kind of research needs to be given more profile and used in some way. I think there's like, as we were talking about in the previous session, how do you actually use that knowledge now and that history to actually do something?
Can I just chime in? Sorry, before when you asked Alice, so it was like unmuting and it froze a bit. I think my question there is sort of for everybody, but as a researcher, I think you're absolutely right that there's all of this work that's being done and that's been done for decades now. But because it hasn't been surfaced, there's this sort of constant recreation and sort of reframing of the same facts, if you like. Do you know what I mean? A constant need to sort of re-articulate again that some, you know, the basic facts of the past. And so I guess the question is, my question to the sort of everybody, because I don't know the answer, as researchers, you know, we talked earlier, as you said, Anjali, about sort of disseminating the work beyond our little silo of scholars who work in our little field. And, you know, how do we do that? You know, for example, the Black Artists and Modernisms project, maybe that's something you could talk about a little bit. You know, that documentary that you made, and as somebody that teaches in a university, that was massive for students, because you think we can tell them to read text and all of this, but to see it on TV, you know, on the BBC was really, it shifted things, I think. So I don't know if you wanted to talk a bit about that, or Andy, if you had any ideas, you know, thinking also digitally as a platform for this.
I've always thought that when an exhibition is put up, you would think as part of the cost of that exhibition, you would try and sort of freeze it digitally at the end so that you have that record going forward. And if you look back now, you know, how useful that would be if such exhibitions were archived in that way and made accessible. You know, possibly those collections would, they charged for it at the time, they might feel they need to charge a little bit for people to see it again in the future. But I think as a way of operating going forward, I think that could be a very useful way of helping in at least a small way to solve this issue.
I think there's a just following on from Liz's question about or her comments on that BBC documentary. You know, at the time that piece was being made, I mean, there was a huge amount of debate about how to bring that story to sort of a national, non-art-going public. And I think the role for television and particularly for public service television in terms of helping to tell the story of, I mean, to tell so many stories, you know, about Black artists' relationship to modernism, about the work that's being made, the work that is held and where it's held. I think there's still a lot of work that could be done with public broadcasting that we've just kind of not even, you know, we've not even really started that process. So as, you know, as valuable as that documentary is, it really just it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of that story. But I also think that, you know, it's about kind of bringing all of those points of interaction together. So as well as that, the BBC documentary, I'm constantly reflecting on the extent to which the public collections, whether those are regional or national collections, make a concerted effort to tell that story. You know, the other story is now, how old is that work now? 21 years ago, is it? Or more? 31 years ago? And there really hasn't been anything else that has responded to that that's responded to that particular history, to that particular story of the relevance of Black artists' work within the national story of art, let alone a broader sense of how what artists make is relevant to the way that we live and the way that we understand our humanity. So I think there's still a huge amount of work that could be done, you know, in all of those spheres. And just to respond to Sarah's question about how this knowledge kind of dips in and out of memory, you know, as somebody that has been working since the 80s, I'm actually terrified by how easily artists work can disappear and how those stories can disappear from national memory. I was reflecting the other day on the work of Maud Salter. Now she's an artist who during her lifetime was actually very successful in exhibiting, in you know, working across a number of platforms, but it was disturbing that her profile, she literally disappeared from even from the documentation of the collections in which her work had been collected, let alone those where her work hadn't been collected. So I think there's a kind of concerted effort that is needed from art historians and curators to kind of join up those stories and to make them accessible and available. And I did make a note when Andy was talking earlier about the way that he's trying to work with the digitally, about expanding the editorial and expanding editorial voices, because I think that's one of the ways, the most coherent ways that knowledge can be shared and developed.
Thank you, Marlene. That's really great. Angeline?
Yeah, just wanted to pick up on what Marlene was saying. And I think there's, you know, we know that in the past, you know, a lot of the knowledge that we have around that exhibition history that I touched on, lots of it doesn't come from archive. It comes from the artists who were involved, who who archived the exhibition ephemera, the conversations, the letters, everything themselves. And we know there was erasure in the past, or a failure to do proper documenting of that work. And you know, I think I don't know to what degree things have changed, but I know from my own research experience of even exhibitions now, proper documenting isn't always happening. You know, I remember researching the Afro-Modern exhibition in Liverpool 10 years ago, and you know, asking permission to take photos of the installation, and being told by the curators there that no one had taken any photos of that show at the time. And you begin to wonder, well, why not? Why are you not, you'll be documenting other exhibitions, but you're actively choosing not to document this on some level. So, you know, I really would urge every institution to put in place a policy, a practice of diligently documenting exhibitions and what happens that makes so that, you know, the correspondence, the decision-making process, all of it.
Great. Sarah, I'll turn to you in a moment. Corinne, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that there's a parallel situation in heritage, because quite often even the institution forgets that it held exhibitions previously, and there is no institutional memory of an important piece of work that's been done before. So, for example, in 2007, there was loads and loads and loads of exhibitions throughout the country in heritage sites, which were responding to the Heritage Lottery Fund, a call for funding for the commemoration of the bicentenary of the abolition of slavery. And it was incredible the number of exhibitions that happened, but they were all temporary exhibitions, so they had a lot of impact at the time, but they had no long-term impact on reshaping the ways in which heritage sites talked about their history as being somehow local and having nothing to do with the rest of the world whatsoever, and or empire in particular. And so I think it is vital what the other panelists are saying about not simply remembering at a national scale, but also remembering within your own institution, especially if it's a large one, because you have a turnover of people, and that is how things get forgotten. So it's just essential, I think.
Yeah, Sarah, would you like to come in?
Just wanted to share briefly that in terms of strategies around erasure, we were talking previously about the networks of, well, directors like the National Museum Directors Committee, the English Civic Museum network, and those are networks, you know, that are important, that I sit on those, but they are very white networks, as you can imagine. On the NMDC, there's only 3 non-white people, 2 of them are me and Zach, and similarly, you know, on the ECMN, the English Civic Museums Network, and Rian King, I think, is on this, you know, and so are some of the other directors. That I think one of the things we've been doing recently, women of colour in the sector who are gallerists, there's a sort of, we're starting to identify each other and map each other in the sector, and there's a sort of feminist consciousness that we are fostering amongst ourselves to make sure that just as we are spending time in those networks, and we must be at those tables, we must be together as women of colour and feminists who are gallerists and curators and decision makers, so that people now are meeting Rita McLean, who I was talking about before, who are, you know, someone in their 30s like Farhana Begum, who is director of St Albans Museum, may never have even known or met Rita. And now we're making sure that we're all connected, so that that's one strategy to mitigate against that erasure, just literally our own consciousness and our own knowing our own history, basically, quite literally, as professionals in a lineage and a canon. Another canon is one tactic.
I've got 2 sort of connected questions, one from Amy Concannon and the other from Carol Thompson. And Amy's asking about class and issues around class and how we can diversify galleries and gallery audiences beyond the habitat buying middle classes, and what are the socioeconomic barriers that are preventing that engagement. And sort of slightly related to that, I think, is if we're talking about expanding a canon of British art history, or an expanded conception of the nation, how Carol Thompson asks about, well, how can we do that and bring our traditional audiences with us? So do our panelists have any ideas or strategies about what we can do to both broaden out but also retain?
Can I start?
Yeah, Corinne, please.
I have a few thoughts on this in relation to the heritage sector, but remember, of course, the heritage sector does have extensive art collections. So, I mean, one of the things that the National Trust has done is tried to explore the story, the below stairs story in those big country houses, for example, and it's been very popular, and it has helped broaden their audience. But I think it's really important not to talk about race or class as if they're 2 separate things. And a brilliant example of that in terms of historical interpretation and you know, the stories we tell about these heritage sites and their collections is that the links between working class history, rural poverty, and colonial history are so strong and underexplored that I think it's really, really important to explore those. And then just one more point about taking audiences with you. The policy exchange, which is actually quite a conservative reaction to things like the National Trust report, its own survey showed that 76% of National Trust members thought that the National Trust should talk about its histories of colonialism, empire, and its links to historic slavery. And so I'm not convinced that people don't find this interesting because it doesn't resonate with their own personal history. So I just wanted to jump in there.
Thank you. Thank you. Really important points.
Also, just to add, everyone's personal history is a colonial history. So it's all of our history, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which actually leads to, I think, there was a question, if you bear with me while I try and find it, but it was about whether or not in making these curating nation and creating these national narratives, whether or not we should be looking globally and in discussion with institutions in Guyana or Accra or Singapore, which is really interesting. And I think I know we are going to be talking about that in a future workshop.
Sorry, that's why, Alice, you couldn't find the question. This is a question by Birgit Ahrens. And I just sort of pointed Birgit to say, well, that's what workshop 3 is going to be primarily.
Okay.
You do have to come to that. But it would be great to hear any perspectives from this panel on that idea, or what you've already done, or any projects that you've done in that regard.
Yeah, could I jump in again? I promise not to monopolise. I'm just thinking about Paris Castle. You know, Paris Castle has got the largest collection of objects belonging to Tipu Sultan outside India. And it's very, very relevant to audiences in India and, you know, across that continent, the whole of the continent, for various reasons. And so one of the beauties, I think, of the COVID crisis, I mean, obviously there's no beauty associated with it at all, but one of the possibilities that became more obvious is that you can connect with heritage professionals, experts and curators across continents and have those conversations with those groups of people who have something absolutely significant to contribute in exchange. In terms of curatorial possibilities and linking connections and stories and archives, there's just so much we can do without even stepping on a plane.
There is, just on a practical level, one of the questions that came in, Corinne and Ingrid, was whether or not the materials that you produced are publicly available, or are they only distributed in schools, or how might we learn more about the project?
Yeah, the children's writing is on the Colonial Countryside website at the university, not on the National Trust version of it. So I'll put the link in a second. And then there is a book of commissioned writing, which is coming out later this year with People Tree Press. And yeah, there are several bits and pieces. The schools resources also, I'll post a link in as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And Sarah's just put in the chat that the Birmingham partnership with Bangladeshi arts organisations has been developing a lot in the last 5 years. And there's a link where I'm guessing we can find out a bit more, Sarah, is that right? Perfect. Well, would anyone like to have any final thoughts, or any sort of anything that they really burning to say that they haven't had an opportunity to say yet?
One thing I'd say is,
Andy.
Yeah, just the previous question, socioeconomic question. I think a key point here to remember is the role played by schools here, and the concerns around the, the marginalization of the teaching of the arts in schools, and how we need to sort of fight against that, because it is so important at that early age, particularly at primary school, that we can introduce young people to the arts, to the national collection. So I think it's just, we really mustn't forget that, how important that is.
Absolutely. Okay, well, at this point then, I'd like to thank all of our participants in today's workshop. On behalf of Hammad, Lizzie, Marlene, thank you all so much. And Marguerite, Andy, Sarah, Anjali, Ingrid and Corinne, your contributions have just been phenomenal, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and perspectives today. Our sincere thanks also to the University of the Arts Decolonizing Arts Institute for hosting today's Zoom session, and for the British Art Network for all their support behind the scenes. Today's session has been recorded, so please keep an eagle eye out. We will be sending out notifications about where you'll be able to access those recordings. And please do follow us on the Black British Arts Research Group on Twitter. We'll have further announcements about future workshops. And Hammad's going to say something about next week.
Sorry, I've lost the PowerPoint slide, but what I wanted to remind everybody was that we will have another, our second workshop will be the same time on next week. And the second question that we'll be putting to our panelists and participants will be, what stories of British art travel? So we will be joined by Emma Dexter, Roger Malbert, Francis Morris, Abbas Zahidi, Wing Chang, and Zara Jumaboy. So we have this sort of collection again of sort of people who are dealing with this question as museum directors, curators, scholars, and artists. So please do join us and get, to think about what happens when we may be producing small acts, but if we're still distributing Downton Abbey, and today we just announced that there will be a reprise and a second version, how do we get a mixture of these things circulating in our world? With that, thank you all for sticking around with us for these 3 hours. And we hope that many of these questions will continue to niggle in your shoe as well. So until next week, thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.